Imagine this. You're running 2 short-term rentals on an island thousands of miles from your desk. You manage the cleaning, you handle the guests, you optimize the listings, and you do all of it while working full-time at one of the world's biggest short-term rental data companies. This week on The Check-In, we're talking to someone who lives in the data whilst living in the trenches. Someone who lists on Airbnb and Booking.com. Someone who sees both the dashboards and the dirty laundry. And we're asking a simple question. What does it really take to operate a profitable short-term rental business as a one-person show?
And here we are. I am so pleased today to be chatting with my dear friend and colleague at Airbnb, James Kinnersly. James has 2 properties in Tenerife, in the Canary Islands in Spain. And so today we're going to bring you a bit of a view of what's happening with the host side of things. We often talk about the companies that are involved in this, but what about the little guy? So here today, without further ado, James Kinnersly, super excited to welcome you on. So James, tell us a little bit about the origin story of your properties and your business. Why Tenerife?
Well, thanks for having me again, Sarah, and a big fan of your pod, and great to see you and Leo going out at it together. Origin of the story, it is pretty simple, to be honest with you. My parents have a place there and spend their winter there. I grew up a lot of holidaying and time spent there, so it's always been quite close to my heart. Also, from a perspective of like an opportunity and a long-term market, realistically, it's basically a 11 or 10 month season with a couple of kind of dotted months between like May, I think, and September, the kind of more low months. And prices when I first invested in kind of pre and just after COVID were extremely reasonable, meaning that there was a good investment opportunity, if you like.
Awesome. And tell us a little bit more about your properties and sort of the typical guest that you would have at one of your properties.
I say the typical guest probably is toward the kind of young family market would be where I kind of try to target. Obviously, there's a bit of a mixed bag. You have some of the oldies and or kind of folks looking to maximize winter sun time. In general, I'm targeting the kind of young professional or younger family market.
And in terms of like your biggest assumptions pre-hosting, so I'm sure you went into this thinking you were going to make millions, but what is it actually like, and kind of what are the biggest misconceptions, I guess, about property management?
It's a good question. I think probably when you start, you think you just get the property, stick it online, Airbnb or Booking or VRBO or whatever, and the bookings will roll in. Ultimately, specifically, I know you're going to probably come on to this, but when you're looking at this kind of perspective, what's critical is having the right team around you, whether that's like the folks helping you with cleaning or the check-in, check-outs. Understanding that is key early on. Further to that, it's pretty important to realize that like how you design and get set up is critical to the like long-term potential of the properties. I think in general, it's probably a bit like running or owning a bar. You think you're going to be sitting there running around with your friends, but ultimately there's a lot of cleanup, there's a lot of stock, there's a lot of stuff that you need to organize. And so that's a feature that people need to probably bear in mind, specifically if they're operating it from afar.
Yeah, sure. And that brings us to a good point, because you manage all of your properties completely remotely. So what is kind of the additional challenge there, and how did you set up that team?
Yeah, it's a good question. Ultimately, I think the difficulty is that you're just not on the ground, right? So if you need to fix something, it's not jumping on a plane and flying 3.5 hours from Barcelona ultimately, right? So, finding the right team is critical. Luckily, I sort of fell on my feet, found this lady that operates as well a number of other professional kind of really professionally run properties. She's got a good team around her, a team that I can trust. And then when we started with a property to start with, and then on to both properties, so the things moved on from there. But I suppose there's 2 ways of looking at it, right? One, you could say, do you put this in the hands of a professional manager and say, okay, right, like my investment's going to be made on just the property itself, and I'll take the hit of whatever the 20% management fee is? Or do you take the decision that you're going to run it yourself just to get a grip with how it's all working? And I was much in the latter party than the former, partly because I'm obviously working in the business to a certain degree with your DNA perspective, and then also from the understanding as well of just wanting to manage the properties myself.
And let's talk a little bit about the OTAs. Everyone loves to pick on the OTAs. And, you know, we've talked a lot about some of the changes coming down the pipeline, especially from Airbnb, everything from the changing cancellation policies to genius discounts on Booking.com, all sorts of things. So I guess you're listing on both Airbnb and Booking, but would love to kind of hear from your perspective a little bit more about your experience with the different OTAs.
Yeah, again, good question. I know there's a lot of back and forth between kind of professional management versus the large OTAs. In general, I would say I get 95% of my, maybe not 95, 90% of my bookings from booking.coms. Ultimately, it's an entity that I can't not work with. I find in general, as a user, from a kind of buyer perspective, I really like the booking.com process. I find as a host, the kind of priority sits as booking.com, the guest, and then a couple of miles south, the hosts themselves. In all honesty, I've been quite blessed with the type of folks I've had to visit and stay. But in general, when you have had kind of run-ins, dealing with the booking.coms of this world has been tricky. I found my relationship with Airbnb and the type of Airbnb traveler to be, again, a decent traveler. I would like to get more bookings from Airbnb. I don't know exactly how the algorithm seems to dominate that booking.com guests seem to get it rather than Airbnb guests, but I think ultimately starting in the business, you can't deal without them. And though the direct booking function, I think we'll probably come on to talk about that in more detail, we'll look at something that you've got to try to have in play. Ultimately, you live and die a bit by the performance of your OTA, your property on the OTA sites, essentially.
Yeah, and do you notice a big difference, for example, between the caliber or type of guest that you get from one platform versus another?
In general, no. I have had probably more longer stays, so maybe more like younger professionals who take the Airbnb route that stay for a month or whatever. Otherwise, the standard is, as I mentioned before, kind of younger families, because I have a 3-bed, 2-bath with swimming pool and lifts and all the kind of bells and whistles. And the other one, again, similar with swimming pool and whatever. So it's kind of catering a bit to the holiday angle market, to be honest with you.
And do you update pricing? Do you do anything differently with pricing? I know we talked historically about the genius discounts that Booking.com offers. So is that something you take into account when you're doing your pricing as opposed to on Airbnb? Do you have different strategies for that based on the OTA?
Yeah, again, use of AirDNA data is quite handy to be able to kind of see where you sit versus your competition. I think that's quite handy, and being on top of that is always an advantage. There's little tricks as well, which like the OTAs try to do, because ultimately for them, it's like a booking's a booking. The margin doesn't, obviously it's better to get €1,000 booking than it is to get a €500 booking because the commission's better, but ultimately they prefer the stay to happen than not happen. So ultimately it's understanding competition, it's understanding what kind of range of pricing you're able to get to, though I found in my specific market, like a number of your listeners will probably find that like ultimately there's a ceiling on what price point you can put on a 3-bed, 2-bathroom property, because as soon as you stray into the kind of smaller, more compact villa, even at the low end, ultimately, who's not going to stay in the villa with a pool and its own kind of entity, rather than staying at an apartment? Frankly, like no one. So you've got to be a little bit conscious of where you price, and sensitivity perhaps isn't the same as a fluctuating large market like a Paris or a London or a Barcelona or whatever. But ultimately, you still live and die by exactly how you price and how competitive that looks.
Let's get into some data, James. You and I both work in data all day. So what does the data tell you about Tenerife? And then how does that differ from your actual experience in the market?
As I said, we're quite lucky in the Canaries to have a pretty extended season. So in general, high season would be from October through to about after Easter. So you're probably talking like end of March. That's really where you make a bigger margin, because you have all the folks that are looking for winter sun, primarily from the kind of Northern European locations. And then you have the classic kind of quintessential summer holiday stuff, but otherwise your kind of May and September gaps are when it's still quite pleasant in Europe and the kids are still in school. So ultimately you're left with those 2 months. But in general, when it comes down to picking a market, we're pretty lucky because you have this kind of extended period of time. Now, when it comes down to the data, I think in general, how do we perform versus the rest of the market? In general, we have performed better than our peers in the winter, so the high season, than we do in the summer. Though I think that caters a little bit to what price you're prepared to sell the property, right? Because ultimately, the lower you go, the more you open yourself up to some of the profile and characteristics of visitors that you're not really, or I'm not really encouraging to receive. And that means, it means youngsters visiting within the larger groups who want to party or whatever. So I try to stay away from that if I can.
Can't imagine not wanting a bunch of 18-year-old lads on lads holiday at your flat. And are there any myths that maybe you had about data, like before getting your properties? You work at AirDNA, as you said, you thought, well, I'm going to manage them myself, because like if I can't do it and I have access to all the data. nobody can do it. So were there any sort of myths that once you got into it, you were like, actually, the data works for this, but maybe it's less useful for this other thing, and this is more of a gut feeling, boots on the ground sort of thing?
Yeah, I think you never quite know until you're actually running it properly, that you can't just say, okay, well, this is where your kind of business plans not go out the window, but like you can start with a forecast as to what you think you're going to be able to perform versus what the reality looks like, and learning like how the seasonality and trends work is critical. I think anyone who enters into a market and thinks they're just going to get a revenue management system and stick it online and just let it go to work, I think is kidding themselves. Ultimately, you need to still do a lot of homework on who your competitors are, how they price, because everyone's guided to a certain degree on price sensitivity. Certainly, if the two things you're looking for stack up the same, you're going to be more and more than anything guided by price. Getting to know your market is critical on the ground, and then understanding as well, like the ins and outs of the minutiae of different holidays, periods, and how you can price, and not missing out those opportunities as well. I think the other way around is, it's very easy to set the next year's pricing and not look specifically at when Easter falls, or understanding exactly when a specific holiday might fall. Like you can really miss out on some big revenue earning potential if you don't quite get that right.
And as an operator, especially operating from a distance, what are some of the tools that you couldn't live without? So technologies, softwares, anything like that?
I think in the early days, actually, when you start with like one property, probably 2 to 3, you can get away with just using the bare minimum if you're looking to be really tight and careful, should we say, in your initial spends. But when it comes down to it, if you want the flexibility and automation, then ultimately you just got to embrace some other parts of technology and other spends. I think they actually end up not being spends, more investments, because when you look at like what a PMS offers you, the ability to kind of change pricing across multiple platforms, unify inbox, all the ins and outs which everyone kind of gets, but also the automated messaging, right? Like we have also day jobs, as it were, being able to make sure that when someone makes a booking, then an automated message is received pretty much, or is sent pretty much automatically or immediately as soon as they've made a booking is critical. Being able to make sure you don't miss any messages because it's all unified makes things easier. Combining this kind of calendars with cleaners is critical as well. So I think it's one thing like, yes, it's a bit of a spend or an investment to start with, but I think you get that back like multiple times over as soon as you set things up appropriately. So that's the PMS side. I think the data side is critical, right? Like, and this is a bit biased, but there are other providers out there, but having an AirDNA as an option gives you a good understanding as to what's actually going on in that market. Without that understanding, like you're kind of shooting in the dark a little bit. So I think those are the two critical things. Of course, there's loads of other bells and whistles you can add to your kind of stack, but until you get to a certain size, I'm always quite careful to not spend.
Yeah. And that brings us to an interesting question as well about the PMS. And, we've talked much about the reliance of especially single operators on the OTAs and how they basically hold all the power because there's not that distribution. Last week on the pod, we talked about this idea with Boris Pavlov from Flataway about how we're maybe 6 months out from OpenAI and these other AI tools being able to essentially integrate directly with a PMS as a new manner of distribution, essentially kind of getting rid of the OTAs. Is that something that you would feel comfortable doing? And do you think it's going to happen?
Good question. I'd probably wait for Boris to be much more informed than I on these kind of matters. But I think realistically, the technology kind of is thereabouts anyway. The question for me is whether the behavioral change will happen as quickly. I think it's the same thing we see is all over, right? It's like once upon a time, no one was a travel agent. Then now everyone's kind of a travel agent, whether you use a kind of meta search or you go into Skyscanner or whatever to find everything, you know how to shop the web for that. I don't know if the same thing's going to happen quite as quickly. The technology will certainly be there. Whether the behavior will catch up in the same speed will be the next question. Whether I'm comfortable, frankly, whatever the source is to get me the booking, I don't really care where it comes from. If I can shorten the amount of commission I'm paying elsewhere, i.e. not paying 18% to booking.com or whatever, then sure, I think that would be exciting. It's just whether the trend of the behavior will follow the speed of the technology.
Okay. And for any of our listeners out there who are thinking about getting into the game, what is one thing that if you could go back in time as a brand new host that you would absolutely do again, or a tip that you would give yourself in those early days?
I mean, for those of the people who are buying as an investment to start with, it's critical. I think this is the same story over, even if you're not looking, if you're just looking at investment property. it's about the purchase, right? Like if you buy badly or buy expensively, you're never going to see that return. Frankly, you can still have the property work well, but being conscious of taking a location which operates well throughout the year, that you have the right kind of licensing environment that is user friendly with this kind of business. I think a lot of folks got into this thinking that this is a forever business and it doesn't really matter and what will be. Have found themselves with maybe slightly burnt fingers. So the Canaries has been great for me, not from any personal note, but also from the point of view of it's a long season. Property prices at the time were particularly well priced for this kind of investment. So I'd be pretty conscious of looking where there's a good investment from a property standpoint, and then also seeing what the business ramifications would be as well. Like how user friendly is it on the ground? How can I get set up? Who are the successful operators in that location? Those are the questions I'd really be asking. At the time, I thought this was just a good investment property and thought, well, I need to have some skin in the game. And it's worked out well, but I would do that due diligence, maybe 3 or 4 times in as depth as what I did at the time.
And I know as well, with both of your properties, you did a small renovation. And I know you and I had a couple of conversations where you were coming in frustrated because you had chosen maybe something that was a little bit on the cheaper side and with wear and tear, things like that. What is the sort of sweet spot and how do you find that? Is it all based on those revenue projections, as you mentioned, and kind of doing that due diligence to determine, okay, what is the level of quality that I need to put into this reno without wasting money? And what are some of other tips like that you would think would be necessary when you're looking at that return on investment specifically?
Sure. It's difficult, right? Because you want to find the balance between not being a cheapskate and getting low-end products that aren't going to last, and then also not buying, top-of-the-range custom furniture, right? Like, obviously, there's a middle ground. In general, we found that things that are likely to cause more trouble to a guest, such as a boiler, such as the quality of kitchen items, such as kind of these features are the quality and comfort of a bed, right? Is pretty important. How the cupboards look or are painted or the coat hangers you use or some of the more basic stuff, the glassware, I don't think is as critical, but some of the main things that you take into account, you think that if I was the visitor here, what's going to annoy me? What do I use well? And that's time on the ground, understanding also how your property. I would actually advise a lot of people to stay in their property. It sounds slightly strange, but why wouldn't you, right? You can get the ins and outs saying this placement of whatever's annoying or this light doesn't work or whatever. The ins and outs of knowing your property is really puts you in a much more advantageous position to understand how actually stuff works or doesn't work, as the case may be.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, actually. Our mutual friend, Sarah, who decorated my flat at James's suggestion, the one that I purchased for rental here in Barcelona, she actually mentioned to me that when they are doing an Airbnb, they normally have, with all of the contractors and the owner and herself, a party. And they basically challenge themselves to cook. You don't necessarily have to sleep over, but they challenge themselves to cook a meal, and then she encourages the owner of the property to stay in it for the night, shower, do all of those things. Exactly because of that. Because then you realize what you're actually missing, potentially from the property and what guests are going to think. So it's actually a really great tip, James. I appreciate that. Okay, the $1 million question. If you had to do it all over again, I know you've toyed back and forth with, should I have managed it myself? Should I have given it to a management company? What would you do differently? Would you give it to a management company, or would you continue to do it yourself with the operations you have on the ground?
Good question. I don't think I can give you a direct answer. I think it depends, right? If I were doing this from another perspective, I always wanted to get in the business to do it myself anyway, right? So I think to start with, it wasn't a question of how am I just going to make the property investment and hand it over? But I think a lot of people who have much more fewer hours in the day than I did at the time could think also that you're making the margin on the property, give it to a property management company. I think in general, I think we've discussed this, Sarah, before, give it a chance yourself to run things, at least for the first year. Then you get all the ins and outs of how things work in the property, what things don't work in the property. More importantly, how the ins and outs of the business actually work, what needs to be organized. I think if someone comes in, it's quite easy to have the wool taken over your eyes and not know anything about how the actual business works. So my view would be yes, do it. Yes, give it a full year, like anything else, until you've done something really for a year. It's quite hard to take away the ins and outs of how everything works. And actually, you can have a bit of fun with this as well and understand the business a bit better. certainly from how you change with pricing, where you list, getting your own website together, all this stuff is like quite good for other things as well. So yes would be the answer, but with a caveat that maybe just try it for the first year because you can also change afterwards.
Yeah, that's exactly the same advice that I got when I launched my rental, and I have done it almost for a year now, and I am ready to hand it over to somebody else because I am tired. Even if it's the little things, it's more the mental load, right, of those day-to-days. So amazing. Well, thank you so much, James. I really appreciate the time. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for joining us on the pod. Thanks, buddy.
A lot. Cheers.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I tell you what, if you want a man with opinions, James is a good guy to talk to, isn't he?
He is. I had a feeling he would be perfect for this segment where I for a long time been wanting to do something where we get a little bit away from sort of the corporate side of things and professional managers and really get down to what it means for an individual host. We know from data that individual hosts represent, depending on the market, up to 80% of all of the properties, right? They're managed by an individual host. So this is huge, which I think is an interesting and important perspective for us to have on the podcast. So thanks again to James for joining us. And I think he made some really interesting points that I think you don't get with more of a corporate view, maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, again, lest we forget that short-term rental is a local game managed by local owners, people with one or two listings. Yeah, it's a view from the ground that we want to get more often. Obviously, James is a very good friend of yours and mine, and a good friend of the show. So he's a good guy to get on regularly. So lots we could pick out. We'll go through it, but for you to begin with, I think you said to me off camera you were surprised at his answer to how challenging and how much work there is since he has more than one property, right?
Yeah, it was one of the things that I've always admired about James. I think he actually enjoys some of that part in a way that I would not. So he loves somebody calling him and saying, hey, do you have a dinner recommendation? And not only does he give them a dinner recommendation, he's like, yeah, when do you want to go? I'll call Roberto for you and I'll make you the reservation. But that guest hospitality, he is excellent at. I think the last time I looked, he has like 4.9 stars. And that's all him. Like, it's all down to the communication. Of course, he has an amazing team in place that he trusts, which I think, especially when you're managing from afar, is super important. But James has that je ne sais quoi that not everybody, I think, has in terms of how he's treating the guest. And I know that he's mentioned to me sometimes, like, that's the most frustrating part. He nodded to it a little bit in the pod. But it's the most frustrating part for him sometimes of being far away from his properties, as if something goes wrong and you need to smooth things over with the guest. There's always going to be that sort of distance. He can't just pop over there and be there in person. So that for sure is one of the things that I know he's struggled with more from a personal level than the guests, because his reviews speak for themselves and his guests don't seem to mind. They're always talking about how attentive and wonderful James is. But it's definitely something to keep in mind, especially from afar, that you need to kind of go that extra mile. And that's what sets a lot of the individual hosts apart from some of the larger companies, is that personal touch. So that definitely got harder when he had two properties as opposed to one, and sort of dealing as well with the check-ins and the cleanings. I remember the first time he got a booking and a check-out and check-in on the same day for both of the properties. And it was like, how am I supposed to do this? And luckily they're close together and they're in the same area. And so he has the same staff that he trusts to be able to do both. But it was a little bit tricky to manage, I think, initially for him when he got the second property. There was a learning curve that I don't think he expected about the difference in sort of day-to-day management and responsibilities that two employ rather than just one.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, what stands out for me, one, he's clearly a hospitality guy, and we always talk about that, right? The need to be in service to your guests, the need to see it as a hospitality business. It's not a real estate company, right? Because there's so much in-stay service, and James is a real example of that.
Yeah, he is.
He's managing to do it from Barcelona, even though he's managing to do it in Barcelona, but I think the secret here is he really knows the area where the properties are. So he's not really fully doing it remotely. He has that local knowledge, so he can make those restaurant recommendations and other types of recommendations for his guests on the fly.
He does. He's a lucky guy. I would say he spends maybe 4 weeks a year with his wife working over there in Tenerife. His family has a property there, and so they go and they work remotely, and they know the area, and they know the restaurants, and they know the restaurateurs. They know things that people might want to do as families or as couples or whatever the case may be. So that knowledge of the area makes it really different. It's not me investing in a property on some Greek island that I've never visited for sure. And that makes a huge difference. I think one of the things that shocked me, Leo, I'm keen to get your take on it, but I was sort of shocked at his bearishness, shall we say, on the topic we talked about last week, which was really about the emergence of AI and if this is going to lead to more direct bookings. As he mentioned on the podcast yesterday, all of his bookings come from the OTAs. He does have a direct booking website, but it's few and far between that he actually gets guests from there. So something like 90% of his bookings are from Booking.com and a smaller percentage from Airbnb. But I was surprised that he was quite bearish on the AI integrations and the future of OpenAI and recommending and being able to book travel through those. What was your take on that?
Yeah, well, I think we have to be careful as hospitality tech providers and people in the SaaS world not to always talk about the future trend, what we think is coming. And obviously, we spend a lot of our time talking about service and in-stay and hyperlocal. So, we try and avoid doing that because you don't just want to be making bets on the future, because right now it is still slightly a bet on the future. We're saying we believe that people will be searching in this way. We believe that people will be executing travel plans in this way. So he's completely right to have his own opinion on it and to maybe try and think slightly outside of the box, because short-term rental, it's messy. It's not as easily boxed as hotel booking, right? Which is scalable, repeatable, and so that's always been a challenge within our industry. So perhaps when it comes to trust, people will still ultimately need to go towards an OTA for a while longer, and then you've got to say none of us are fully correct in our predictions about what consumer behaviour will be, because it will undoubtedly change rapidly. But I would be more bullish than James. To qualify that, I would be more bullish because I think it's coming. But again, when we also talk about the application of AI on the ground as well for property management companies, just consider this for a second. I know this is not the question you asked me, but it relates to AI. There is still a very large percentage of short-term rental hosts with multiple properties or one property who will be managing their listing from Excel spreadsheets, and they may use they might use OTAs like Airbnb and Booking. They probably do, but they're still managing their business at the back end in a very manual way. So when I speak to PMSs, they always tell me of one or two deals they win in a show where someone's decided to come off Excel and onto using it. You'll know this from your AirDNA days. Lots of people aren't even using their data. Lots on. So you can't assume that every short-term rental operator is as tech savvy as the guy you just spoke to at the show, who knows everything, is building their own tech stack, because plenty of them aren't. And so there's the adoption on the guest side, but there's also the adoption on the business side, and it may take longer than we all think. And because we're in the bubble, we can fall foul of thinking that everything's got to have AI in it these days to sell, but it might take longer.
I would agree with that. He also brought up an interesting concept off camera, which was, hey, even if this AI thing goes forward, it's going to be concentrated on two of the biggest PMSs. So let's say Guesty and Hostway, just by number of users that they have. So then what does that mean for anybody who's on a different PMS? Because it's going to take a lot longer. And if you're OpenAI, you're going to prioritize relationships with the biggest in the industry that have the highest number of listings. So that was also something that he brought up, which I think is a valid point to say, okay, is this actually just going to create a monopoly and be a little bit even scarier to where we're switching from the OTAs to now a PMS reliance, where if you're not on the PMS, you're not getting bookings at all, because as soon as this happens, which we also mentioned last week, the second that OpenAI or Google or somebody else finds another way to make money that isn't from the OTAs, I do think they're going to go forward with that. So it's going to get to a point where maybe the OTAs are at a minimum at threat, which is going to impact these individual hosts that are relying on them for bookings. So I thought it was an interesting point for sure that he brought up. Another thing that we didn't touch on too much, but was sort of mentioned in the episode, was this idea of regulation. So one of the reasons that he decided to open and operate in Tenerife, for example, is because although he's based in Barcelona, running a short-term rental is basically illegal unless you were already up and running, which he wasn't at the time. Getting a license is nearly impossible, and now they're basically about to outlaw every single short-term rental by 2028, I think it is. So let's see how that shakes out. But he brings up an interesting point about regulation, which we talk about quite frequently on the podcast, which is there going to come a time where there's certain locations where we don't exist? Our industry ceases to exist because of these regulations. I think, unfortunately, the answer, at least in the short term, might be yes. Hopefully they'll rectify at some point. But it was an interesting point of view for me as well, sort of chatting through that with him. And I know even in the Canaries, there have been some laws that have come into play where he had to adapt. So he's always been licensed, Leo. But there was a new law that came into effect, which we talked about on the podcast, I think, when we were with GMH. But essentially now anyone operating as a short-term rental in the Canaries, in order to maintain and retain their license, they had to get sign-off by every single owner in the building, if it's in a multifamily building. Some of these complexes in the Canary Islands, the one that James has one of his properties in, it has 120 owners in the building. And most of those owners might not even live in the Canaries. This is a second home for them. Maybe they live in Germany or in the UK. So he was trying to hunt down all these people to get their sign off. Luckily, there was a portion where after you've notified them X number of times, their silence is considered a yes because they're not opposed, which was good for him. But it took him several months and it was a lot of work. And again, something that if you don't have the personality that James has, for example, I would have just cried under a table. Can't imagine having to try and reach out to 120 different owners to do something that you've already been doing that nobody's complained about, where it's been totally fine. For sure, things are tightening. I'm curious to see where that goes in the future for that particular market. But it is one of the risks that we talk about sometimes of being too hyper-local. What do you do when you become outlawed or something like this comes up? So definitely something to keep an eye on.
I think I've had my viewpoint challenged over the last couple of weeks on this particular issue. So I've always been, as you know, Sarah, a firm believer in putting the powers of decision making in the hands of local government and hyper-local. Let communities decide what their view is on short-term rentals rather than central government control. Right? I've always seen that as being preferable. But we've got some bonus episodes that'll be coming out over the Christmas period that I did in France, Scale France, which is a wonderful event, and different conversations I've had this week when I've been speaking with UK policymakers around Westminster. It's been a time where I've been having these conversations a lot. I think there is also a belief that by localising decision making on this particular issue, it might actually lead to potentially some bad decisions being made based on people having different motivations, potentially a strong hotel lobby, potentially particular voters having a particular grievance from the person that's been voted. So the person who's been voted in has to acquiesce when really the majority of people might take a different view, and it's very short termist. Now, again, I can only go anecdotally. I'm by no means the expert here, but it kind of gave me pause for thought because I've heard about some regulation in some areas that would, on the surface, seem like they would be short-term rental towns, would want it because of the level of second home ownership and the lack of hospitals, schools. These are holiday towns. So I do think we're in for a really bumpy ride, unfortunately, as this stuff rolls out further and gets more complicated. So James might be right to raise that as a topic. And it's even interesting to think that, and we have definitely talked about this on the pod, but it is even interesting to think that locals who might have previous generations of their families may have relied on tourism now feel like tourism is a hindrance in their community. So it's even like the changing face of an area that might have a lot of short-term rentals, but now the local population and even the majority might decide that that's not what they want from their town. And that is very, very, very interesting to me. We in the UK, I think, still take a view of we're happy to see foreign tourists because, hey, they're pretty rare because we're not blessed with the world's best weather. So I think we're pretty open to the idea of people coming in from the outside to spend money in the UK. Our issues come, I think, from domestic tourism and taking over different towns. So we're still very pleased to see foreign visitors. But even in Barcelona, it's the water pistol incident. There seems to be this anti-foreign tourist element to it all as well. So undoubtedly a bumpy couple of years to come, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll definitely keep a pulse on what's happening through James and through others, especially that are operating in some of these more conflictive areas. I would love to, in a future episode, get somebody on from Barcelona and see how this is impacting them and sort of what their game plan is post-2028 when Armageddon comes. But yeah, super grateful to James for joining us. And Leo, you touched on this briefly, but you were at Scale this past week in France, buddy. And we have a lot of really interesting bonus content that we'll be releasing over the holidays from some interviews that we did there. But tell us a little bit more about that and what the experience was like and what your takeaways were.
Yeah, it was fabulous. So Damien invited me, and obviously Damien is one of our contributors to the show. He comes and presents with us or has done in the past and will do in the future. So it's great. He joined me for the interviews. First thing I'd say is the room was absolutely buzzing with about 600 people, which was just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. was incredibly exciting, and it was all in French. So I'm not the world's best French speaker, so I don't think I necessarily got the most out of the sessions. It excited me because it was great to see how locally driven it was, and that's the really, really exciting thing. Sort of 50-60% of the companies in the room I'd never heard of. Also very exciting, because we know what we know, and we live in our tech, we live in our bubble, and we go to VRMA, we go to the shows that we go to, so you think you know everyone. But actually I had some great conversations with some companies that were making a lot of money in the French market, which we know is one of the world's biggest tourist markets. So yeah, it was a really good fact-finding mission, and we'll do more of these features at scale events and other events through the year. So yeah, it was great, and it's nice to meet people on the ground. We talked a little bit about regulation, what excites them about the French market, what frustrates them. So yeah, it was great. And then I finished the week with the Stars of London, the SDR Stars of London event, which was co-hosted by Jessica from Abode and Oliver from Wheelhouse. We got about 80 people into a pub in London on what was actually not the coldest night in London. So the roaring fire was actually a little bit too much. We had a strangely warm evening, so everyone was in t-shirts. It became a sort of tropical Christmas drinks. It was too hot for anyone to wear their Christmas jumpers, but that was fabulous. So really good networking within the space. So yeah, it's been a good week.
That's amazing. Should we give each other, our audience, a little teaser about what we're going to talk about next week on the podcast?
I think that's a very good idea, my friend. So Sarah and I, we're not just, we're busy. We're planning weeks ahead, and we're going to have a look at Airbnb next week. We haven't done it yet, and I think there's been so many changes going on that we think it's time for reflection, to have a look where the business is at. And yeah, anything you'd like to add on it, Sarah?
No, I'm really excited to unpack this with you. And next week it's just going to be you and me, buddy. No guests. So we've got to really prep. It's going to be amazing.
Alrighty. Sarah, great interview. James, thank you. Thanks again for joining. Guys, if you've enjoyed today's show, please hit like, share, subscribe at all the usual social places. This is, again, our new show, The Check-In. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. See you again next week.